funny. Acting and dressing up are often seen, at least from an outside perspective, as a way of expressing yourself, who you really are. However, as someone who's been doing it as long as they can remember, I can attest that it is, in fact, the opposite. And for me, at least, it always has been. As soon as I was somewhat on my way to being a walking, talking human, I started dressing up. It was my favorite pastime, leaving the contents of the dress-up box strewn across the floor and running away to the garden to snag my gauzy fairy wings on the fruit trees and get my white tutu stained in grass, mud, and mulberry juice. I would come back inside at the end of the day, and my dad would read me a story before bed. A fairy tale or fantasy story. They always revolved around a princess, a witch, a dragon, or some other similarly removed topic. For longer than I'm proud to admit, I've wanted nothing more than to close my eyes and reopen them somewhere else, somewhere exciting. In part, this is what motivated me to take up theatre when we moved to the hills. Even when I just started doing shows, costume day was my favorite part. I felt more at home on a stage than anywhere else, but as I've gotten older, I realized that my costumes and my all-encompassing desire to escape this world were my armor. Wrapped in the clothes of a fairy or a tired young mother, I felt safe. People only saw what I showed them, and I never showed them me. I liked that. And I have to tell you, standing up here as myself is not something I remembered I had to do at the start of the year. If I had, perhaps I wouldn't have taken on a challenge that forced me to be so vulnerable. The challenge in question involved taking a yet unexhausted interest of mine, costume design, and exploring it through two of my hobbies, sewing and playing a game with my friends called Dungeons & Dragons, shortened to D&D for simplicity. D&D is, in the simplest terms possible, a choose-your-own-adventure tabletop game with a personalized character. Typically, you need about 5 or 6 people to play. One player taking on the role of the narrator, creating the world, story, and supporting cast, while the other 4 or 5 players control a single character, their actions and decisions. The game typically takes place in a fantasy setting, with characters wielding magic and navigating situations extremely far removed from reality. At the time of its creation, it was geared towards teens wanting to escape, hence its appeal to me. Now, in order to create the aforementioned personalized character that you play as, there are books created for the game that have everything you need in them, including various fantasy races, occupations, weapons, and spells. Along with all this, there are prompts for making your character's personality, which is part of the game relevant to my project. The reason this is relevant is because I chose 2 of the characters I've created for various games of D&D as the characters that I would be costuming this year. Now, all of what I've just said sounds about the furthest thing from a vulnerable process. I'm nice and safe from reality inside the little bubble I've created, right? Not so much. In the process of creating these characters' personalities, they start to fuse with yours. D&D becomes a coping mechanism, a place to play an angry character where there are no consequences for the rest of your life, a place to be vulnerable while not admitting to the hurt that you're feeling from real-life happenings. The 2 characters I have been playing have taken on parts of my personality that I'm not proud of, parts that I try not to show to people, which is terrifying, given I'm now about to tell you all about them. So come with me, and I'll introduce you to the first of the 2 characters that I want you to meet. The side streets of the town are quiet, and as the sun starts to dip in the sky, you hear the faint strains of music and a bustling crowd from the square. Weaving through the hubbub, you can see that a makeshift stage has been fashioned out of a hay wagon, and a young woman in a red coat is standing atop it. A well-cared-for but still worn shirt and sailor's trousers would seem out of place paired with her expensive-looking outer garment, but the set of her jaw and the bruises on her knuckles dissuade anyone who might question her attire. She is tuning a lute, the strings weary from travel gently coming back to form under her skilled hand. This is Mira, previously the only heir to House Kellon. With a few chords, she is ready, and the crowd grows silent. She tosses her hair away from her face, raises her chin, and starts to sing. It's a ballad, a rhythmic, swaying melody telling a tale of two lovers, separated by a myriad of unfortunate circumstances. And there is a clumsiness in the lyrics that suggests that she wrote it herself. Her voice, however, is beautiful, rich, and dynamic. It soars as she describes the joy of the young pair and moves members of the audience to tears as they are tragically separated and go on not knowing if the other lives or not. With the skill of someone much older than she, her fingers coax a tremulous, ancient-sounding melody from the strings of her lute, at times melding with her voice so perfectly, it is as though human and instrument were one. As she finishes, the crowd applauds, and copper coins are tossed at her from every which way. It's getting dark now, and the lit lamps and small braziers scattered through the square pick up the mood, as the performer, the bard, starts to sing a more upbeat sea shanty. Come tomorrow morning, Mira will be gone, and everyone in the square tonight will go back to the mines and storefronts. All bar one. A young woman, dressed in green, notably barefoot, with a flower crown perched atop her unkempt hair, has stood to the side of the main crowd all evening. Although her face is weathered and lined from years in the sun, there is a childlike glint in her eyes as she hums along to the folk song the bard is singing. This is Chandri, the first character I ever made to play D&D, and the second that I want to introduce to you. As the light fades faster, she takes her leave. She lives a little way outside the town, in the forest that almost totally surrounds it. The moon rose full tonight, making just enough light for her to see the path. She's not afraid of what's in the forest. It understands that she protects this part of it. Chandri is a druid, a hermit, and prefers the company of the chickens that she keeps to that of the human population of the town. She has pulled her knitted hood up over her head as the night chill is starting to set in. Although the embers of today's cooking fire are waiting for her, the house will still be cold when she gets home. The door to the ramshackle cottage swings shut behind her, and she lights the oil lamp resting on the kitchen table. Her cloak finds its way to its home on the back of the door, and off come the hood and gloves. She pauses and looks around as she lays them down. The lamplight makes long shadows in the corners, and the little house feels a lot bigger and emptier all of a sudden. She sets about building a fire, and soon the warm glow from the flames chases that sinking feeling away. As she settles into her blankets in front of it, the warmth soothes the loneliness. When she wakes up, it will be sunny. There will be things to care for, and these feelings can be buried. My plans for the project and these characters seemed simple. I would lay them out in front of me and create costumes for them that encapsulated their stories and personalities to the best of my ability. I planned to analyze work by professional designers and pick out the key points of characters' personalities and stories that they used to inform their work. I started drafting the costumes for both Chandri and Mira in January of this year. The designs needed to be completed as soon as possible if I was to finish the pieces by term 3. Mira's design process was simpler, as I had found a pattern for her coat, shirt, and belt that I immediately saw her in and loved. For Chandri's costume, however, I went through about 4 drafts, all very different from each other, before settling on the final. Once I had my designs, I needed to justify them. I needed a rationale. Do the materials I want to use make sense for that character to have access to? What about the dyes? Who made the clothes and how? What trends am I creating within the fashion of these worlds? Which am I deviating from? What do these clothes need to allow the characters to do? During my research, I came across a YouTube video by a fashion historian called Bernadette Banner, analysing the historical accuracy for the costumes from Game of Thrones. She uses historical precedents and processes used in the recreation and study of historical fashion to analyse the depth to which the designer for Game of Thrones, Michelle Clapton, created a grounded and cohesive look for a fantasy world. Her list of considerations inspired mine and made me think about things I had not even thought to consider, such as the trade routes within the world, what might impact them, and how that would impact what materials this world has access to. There was, however, a hurdle in all of this justification. The world I'm trying to fit these characters into doesn't exist. And I'm not sure if anyone in the audience has tried to do this, but creating an entire world and then creating a totally original fashion sense for that world from scratch is really difficult. I needed a reference that wasn't ripping another designer off. A reference that was familiar enough to me that it wouldn't be too steep of a learning curve. Enter my love for history. As I mentioned before, I've always loved stories and immersing myself in them. As I've gotten older, history was a way to do that, a way that challenged my perceptions of the world and extended my thinking. It was a story, just a true one, that informs the world the way the world operates today. It popped into my head as a reference for the silhouettes, functionality, colors, and fabrics that I could justify using in my creations. I put these characters' world on the same timeline as human history, with the same rates of technological advancements. I took inspiration from the elements that Bernadette had considered in her analysis of the Game of Thrones costumes, asking myself where this world was up to in the development of technology, trade, social norms, and economic statuses. In the end, the list of things I considered came to material accessibility, garment construction, class, and character psychology. Each of these, aside from character psychology, involve very little thought to the character themselves and more thought to the world the characters inhabit. I've been calling this the outside-in approach to design, working from the world to the character. What this process looks like when creating the rationale for my design is asking myself a series of questions. It's a barrage of them, and the answers to them relied heavily on some predetermined facts about the worlds that these characters inhabit. The most important factor in this question and answer process was the fact that this world is still pre-industrial. That means that there are no factories, no automated machines such as harvesters, looms, knitting machines, or industrial sewing machines. This meant that I was slightly limited in what materials I could use. For example, zippers, which were not known about until the 1930s, were not logical for me to use as closures for the trousers, as the technology to make them had not existed until decades after the Industrial Revolution. Neither would a lot of synthetic dyes, so I was limited in the colors I could dress Chandri and Mira in. However, this was the area that I took the most liberties in, as well as what fabrics I used. The first thing I considered was material accessibility. What fabric do these characters have access to dress themselves in? I ruled out synthetic fabrics and anything with stretch in it. This left me with cotton, linen, silk, wool, and leather. Chandri lives in relative isolation, and as a result, would make her own clothes. Cotton and linen blends with pieces of leather and wool, all things she can logically source herself or buy raw materials for, made the most sense for me to dress her in. Mira, on the other hand, is a more urban character. She comes from a background of wealth, and the bright red color and expensive look on her coat is appropriately attention-grabbing for a traveling performer. The coat is made out of a synthetic brocade jacquard, a type of fabric typically made from heavy, stiff silk fibers. Synthetic would have to do for me, as the quality I wanted isn't quite in my price range. Secondly, I analysed the garment construction and whether or not it was practical for the characters' lifestyles. Chandri needs ease of movement in her clothes, as her days mostly consist of gardening and gathering, sometimes quite intense physical labour. She needs a full range of arm movement, as well as trousers that don't restrict her legs or stomach. Her clothes would also need to allow for any weight fluctuation, as her access to lots of clothes of different sizes is severely limited. I think I've managed this quite well. Her trousers simply tie at the front and back and are open at the sides of the legs. The blouse is cut in a rectangular shape, the belt doing all of the shaping that you can see in the photos. Mira's clothes, on the other hand, don't require much strenuous movement. Her needs dictate durability and attention-grabbing. The dramatic cut of the coat and sleeves of her shirt make her movements look more exaggerated than they are, and the thick, lined fabric of the coat is more resistant to wear and tear than a single layer. The class of each character also dictates much about what they wear. Mira comes from a high-class family, new money that came from monopolizing trade routes a few generations ago. For this reason, I took inspiration for the coat, particularly the colour, from the Rococo style synonymous with the French courts of the 1700s. Trademarks of the style were cloth of gold, exquisite hand-embroidered silks, meters and meters of ruffles and bows, enormous skirts, and preposterously decorated hair. The elements of drama and Wolff carry through well enough, even on a coat style to be a travelling garment, for her to be adequately intriguing for anyone viewing her. The red colour of the jacket was common in the courts of 18th century France and England. The true vibrant red had been unknown in Europe and Asia until Christopher Columbus bumbled his way into Mexico, where he found the locals using the cochineal beetle to create the most vibrant red dye he had ever seen. Producing the dye was an arduous process, and it took a long time to get from Mexico, where the beetles were harvested, dried, and powdered, to Europe, where it was sold. It became one of the most expensive dyes, synonymous with wealth and status. I thought this visual shortcut and its connotations appropriate for her family connections, however severed they may be due to her current lifestyle. Now, everything I've just said makes it sound like there were very few roadblocks on getting these costumes looking like they do now. Far from it. The biggest hiccups came in the form of perhaps my best work to date, Mira's beautiful red coat. As you can see, there are some differences in colour between some of the panels. This is one of the things that frustrated me the most throughout this whole year. Because I could not find the fabric I wanted in the colour I wanted, I took it upon myself to dye each piece of fabric for the coat myself. This process did not go smoothly, to say the least. You see this very light panel on the front of the coat? I had to recut it and re-dye it because I made perhaps one of the most obvious blunders I have ever made while sewing. I forgot to check what temperature my iron was on, and I melted the synthetic fibers of the fabric. For whatever reason, the dye simply did not take very well on the second time round, but I had to forge ahead. Sadly, my woes were not done yet. The large pieces of fabric that make up the skirt of the coat didn't fit in the pot that I was using to dye them in, and came out very patchy the first time. I gave them another dip in the dye bath, but they were still really light. When dyeing the last two panels of the skirt, I accidentally made the dye mix a bit too orange, and the result was a beautiful, vibrant, dusty orange. Not what I was aiming for. Mind you, this is less than a week before the coat needed to be finished to display at Showcase. I lost it. All of my attempts to lighten the colour failed. All of them. The day before Showcase, I was an absolute mess. Mum ended up driving me to Spotlight. I bought more dye and more fabric, and I tried again for the last time. It still came out extremely light, but it worked. Unfortunately, I don't think I learned my lesson about doing important things last minute and minimizing my anxiety around these things. This anxiety peaked 2 times this year. Once before Showcase, and again when writing this speech. I was nervous that people wouldn't be interested in what I had to say and the things that I'd made. And for a long time, I thought that those anxieties were just about that, until I had a conversation with one of my friends a few weeks ago. After Showcase and the thesis and handing everything in, I had time to sit and think about all of this, and that's when it sank in. These characters were extensions of me, my best and worst qualities, all laid out, wrapped in linen and silk and neatly written down on a little bit of paper. Mira takes no nonsense. She is constantly on edge, ready to defend herself from any perceived slight. She doesn't back down, even when she knows that she is wrong. Pride comes before anything, and if you cross her, God help you. She's a wrathful, aggressive character, but strong. There's an arrogance that comes from her noble upbringing that contrasts with the insecurity of starting fresh in a new place and the desperation of never knowing if you'll make enough money to eat that night. Chandri's strength, on the other hand, lies in the absence of her aggression. She has known sadness, but instead of allowing it to make her bitter, she forced herself to be the opposite. She was a happy person, who laid that happiness and that sunny disposition over all the hurt she was feeling, maybe at her own detriment. In creating these characters for a game that allows me to escape from reality, I have taken parts of myself that I didn't know how to deal with and put them into people, distancing myself from them. Mira is all of that anger that I don't know how to express without hurting the people around me. And Chandri is that inner child that really scares me when she's not distant from my everyday life. Removing them and playing them in a game created a space for me to really process what each of those parts of me need, in a space where there are no real consequences for my real life. It's a therapeutic experience while not being too heavy all of the time. Let's not forget that I'm talking about a game where most people choose to play as an elf. I think that's what this year has taught me. More than it's improved my sewing and drawing skills, more than it's improved my ability to perform under pressure, improved my time management, or forced me to find coping mechanisms that help with my anxiety. Funnily enough, those coping mechanisms turned out to be knitting and sewing the leather pieces of my project. Just getting in there and stabbing the leather with an awl was really good for regulating myself. This year pushed my understanding of why I'm drawn to escapism, why my love of stories and my desire to be anywhere but here has pervaded my entire life so far. For as long as I can remember, all of my creative efforts have revolved around escapism, whether I realized it at the time or not. Dressing up and getting away from yourself only works for so long, and eventually it gets to a place that forces you to put on your own clothes. Many well-meaning peers have suggested that I wear one of the costumes I've made this year and pretend to be one of the characters to help me feel less nervous on stage. In truth, I see no difference between the clothes I've made this year and ones from my wardrobe. These characters are simply extensions of me, maybe just a little less complex. Everything I've done this year has basically forced me to be myself, and I'm sure I don't need to point out the irony in that.
I love you all. Lastly, to my family, your support has been appreciated, often retrospectively, but it never went unnoticed, especially the financial support. Fabric is not cheap. And just off the top of my head, thank you, Dad, for those lovely photos you took of me. And to everyone in the audience, without the wider community, we wouldn't have an audience, so thank you so much. Losing my voice. Are there any questions? Donna. Yeah.
We had a conversation earlier today that I thought would be really interesting to elaborate on here. Which of the characters do you feel closer to, and which do you feel more comfortable talking about? Because I know they're really deep expressions of yourself, and yeah, elaborate, please.
Playing each of these characters is a really different experience. I find it a lot easier to talk about Mira, the red jacket, but a little more difficult to play her and to be her. Whereas Chandri, the character is based more off just a vibe rather than anything else. It's a lot easier to kind of get into that groove. Tori?
Hi, first of all, you guys, this is really cool. You guys are the best. But in any case, I was wondering, would you ever want to design costumes again for characters that you've created? Like, would you want to do that again in the future?
Hell yeah, dude. I had so much fun. I was just like, seriously, I spent most of the year sitting in my room making my costumes for my silly little characters, and I had so much fun when things weren't going horribly wrong. Molly? Yes, so I was using Ritmore's dye more synthetic dyes, which usually are really good. I just kept messing up because I've never dyed anything before. I kept messing up. I added too much water. The dye would get soaked up into the first piece of fabric too much, and then the rest of them that went into the dye bath would be really desaturated. And when it got too orange is when I just gave up on measuring and eyeballed it, which is a bad idea, kids. Don't do that.
Well done, Harry. That was excellent. Where do you think these skills and this passion might lead you in the future?
I'm tempted to say debt. This is really expensive. But I have no idea. Probably I want to start making more of my own clothes, but I don't know. Cosplaying sounds like a fun hobby. Again, an expensive one. Kathy, you had a question?
Do you see yourself playing a role?
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Thank you.